Van Halen had just conquered the world with 1984. Jump was climbing charts. MTV played their videos on repeat. Eddie Van Halen was the guitar god every teenager wanted to be. But in a rented warehouse studio in Burbank, between midnight sessions when his bandmates thought he was sleeping off another bottle of vodka, Eddie was recording something that could have torn the band apart forever. 12 tracks. Raw, unfiltered, brutally honest. The album nobody was supposed to hear. The recordings that vanished into a storage vault for 36 years, until a summer afternoon in 2019 when a climate-controlled facility in Van Nuys revealed what might be rock history's most dangerous secret. What was Eddie hiding? Why did these recordings threaten everything Van Halen had built? And could they really have ended the band at the height of their power? Before we explore this mystery, if you're captivated by untold stories from rock's golden age and the secrets that shaped music history, hit that subscribe button. What's coming will change how you hear Van Halen forever. To understand why Eddie Van Halen felt compelled to create these secret recordings, you need to grasp the suffocating pressure crushing him in 1983. On the surface, everything looked perfect. Van Halen was the biggest rock band in America. They'd revolutionized guitar playing. They'd brought hard rock to MTV. They were printing money. But behind the stage lights and the platinum records, Eddie was drowning in a creative prison of his own making, and nobody around him seemed to notice or care. The 1984 album sessions had been a nightmare for Eddie, though the world would never know it. David Lee Roth wanted pop singles and synthesizers. Ted Templeman, their longtime producer, kept pushing Eddie to simplify, to make things more radio-friendly. The guitar solos that had made Eddie famous were being shortened, edited, sometimes removed entirely, because they didn't fit the new commercial direction. Eddie would arrive at Sunset Sound Studios with complex instrumental pieces he'd been developing, intricate compositions that showcased his evolution beyond the party rock formula. And one by one, those ideas were dismissed. Too long, too complicated, not commercial enough. David wanted anthems for arenas and strip clubs. Ted wanted hits for top 40 radio. Nobody wanted Eddie's artistic ambitions. The synthesizer issue cut deepest. Eddie had started experimenting with keyboards as a textural element, a way to add dimension to Van Halen's sound. But when Jump became a phenomenon, suddenly everyone expected him to be a keyboard player, not a guitarist. Radio stations were playing the synth intro on repeat. MTV was featuring the keyboard-heavy videos, and Eddie Van Halen, the man who'd redefined rock guitar with tapping and harmonic innovation, was being reduced to a synthesizer novelty act. He'd tried to express his frustration to the band, but those conversations always ended the same way. David would laugh it off, make a joke, remind Eddie that they were making millions. Alex, his own brother, would tell him to stop overthinking things, to just enjoy the success. The management team dismissed his concerns as artist temperament. Everyone around Eddie had a stake in maintaining the Van Halen formula. Nobody wanted him to evolve or experiment or challenge the system that was generating so much wealth. So Eddie started drinking more. Vodka became his constant companion during recording sessions. It dulled the frustration, quieted the voice in his head, screaming that he was wasting his talent on 3-minute commercial products. By late 1983, Eddie was consuming a fifth of vodka daily, sometimes more. The alcohol didn't slow down his playing. He could still execute impossibly complex passages while intoxicated, but it was destroying him emotionally and physically in ways that wouldn't become apparent for years. The secret recordings began almost accidentally. Eddie had rented warehouse space in Burbank ostensibly for storing gear and building custom guitars. The space was enormous, a former textile factory with high ceilings and concrete floors. But Eddie saw something else in that empty warehouse, a place where he could create without interference, without David's input, without Ted's commercial calculations. He started bringing equipment over, not just guitars and amps, but a full recording setup. A 16-track reel-to-reel machine, microphones, mixing board, everything necessary to capture ideas professionally. He'd work on his Frankenstrat guitars during the day, the custom instruments that had become his signature, and after dark, when the warehouse district went silent, he'd plug in and record. The first sessions were just Eddie alone, exploring musical territory Van Halen would never touch. Instrumental passages that lasted 8, 10, sometimes 12 minutes. Complex time signatures that moved between 7/8 and 5/4. Classical-influenced compositions that drew from the piano training his mother had forced on him as a child in the Netherlands. These weren't rock songs in any conventional sense. They were sonic explorations, proof that Eddie Van Halen was a composer, not just a guitar hero who could play fast. He'd record until 3 or 4 in the morning, then drive home to Coldwater Canyon, sleep for a few hours, and show up at official Van Halen sessions, pretending everything was normal. Valerie Bertinelli, his wife, knew something was happening. Eddie would disappear for entire nights, coming home as the sun rose, exhausted but creatively energized in a way she hadn't seen in years. When she asked about it, Eddie was vague. Just working on some guitar stuff, personal project. Nothing important. But it was important. It was the most important music Eddie had created since the first Van Halen album, and he knew it. He just couldn't share it with anyone because sharing it would mean admitting how unhappy he was, how trapped he felt in the band that bore his family name. By early 1984, Eddie had started bringing in other musicians. Not Van Halen members, that would have been impossible. These were studio players, jazz guys, session musicians who understood complex arrangements and wouldn't ask too many questions. He'd met a trumpet player named Chuck Findley during the Diver Down sessions, and Chuck became a frequent collaborator on the secret recordings. The addition of horns gave Eddie's compositions an orchestral quality that was miles away from Van Halen's hard rock sound. There was a percussionist named Paulinho da Costa who added Latin rhythms that Eddie had been fascinated with since hearing Santana records as a teenager. And for several tracks, Eddie brought in a keyboardist named Michael Boddicker who could handle the synthesizer parts Eddie was writing. Parts far more sophisticated than the simple hooks on Jump. These weren't casual jam sessions. Eddie was arranging these pieces meticulously, writing charts despite barely being able to read music himself, directing the musicians toward a vision only he could hear. The warehouse became a laboratory where Eddie Van Halen, freed from commercial expectations and band politics, could finally create music that satisfied his artistic ambitions. One composition in particular represented everything Eddie was trying to achieve. The working title was Eruption Part 2, though it bore almost no resemblance to the famous guitar showcase from Van Halen's first album, where the original Eruption was 90 seconds of raw guitar pyrotechnics. This new piece was an 11-minute journey through different musical landscapes. It began with solo acoustic guitar, a delicate finger-picked passage influenced by classical composers Eddie had been studying. Then electric guitar entered, but not with the distortion and aggression people expected. The tone was clean, jazz-inflected, playing melodic lines that intertwined with the acoustic foundation. Around the 4-minute mark, the percussion kicked in, and the piece transformed into something driving and hypnotic. Eddie's guitar work became more aggressive, but always in service of the composition, never just showing off for the sake of technical display. The climax featured a guitar solo that lasted nearly 3 minutes, but it wasn't the usual pentatonic shredding. Eddie was exploring modal playing, harmonic ideas borrowed from Miles Davis and John Coltrane. For anyone listening, this would have been a revelation, proof that Eddie Van Halen's musical vocabulary extended far beyond rock and roll. But here's where the secret recordings became truly dangerous. Eddie started writing lyrics. Not for David Lee Roth to sing. David would never have touched these words. Eddie was writing for himself, and what he wrote was devastating. One song, tentatively titled Gilded Cage, was a direct indictment of the music industry's demands on artists. The lyrics described a musician trapped by his own success, unable to create honestly, because commercial expectations dictated every decision. The imagery was brutal. Golden handcuffs, platinum prison bars, million-dollar muzzles. Anyone who heard it would immediately understand that Eddie was singing about his own situation, about Van Halen, about the success that had become suffocation. Another track called Amsterdam Rain dealt with Eddie's immigrant experience, something he'd never publicly discussed. The Van Halen family had moved from the Netherlands to Pasadena in 1962 when Eddie was 7 years old. The transition had been traumatic. Eddie spoke no English. He was bullied at school for his accent, for his second-hand clothes, for being different. His mother Jan had forced piano lessons on both Eddie and Alex, desperate to give her sons some advantage in this new country, some skill that might lift them above their poverty. Those piano lessons had been torture for young Eddie. Hours of practice when he wanted to be outside playing. His mother's strict discipline enforced with a wooden spoon when he made mistakes. But they'd also given him the musical foundation that made everything else possible. By mid-1984, the secret project had evolved into a complete album, 12 tracks, ranging from 3-minute pieces to the 11-minute epic. Eddie had rough mixes of everything, and he'd started playing them for a very select group of people. Michael Anthony, Van Halen's bass player, was one of them. Michael came to the warehouse one night after an official band rehearsal, and Eddie, several vodkas deep, decided to share what he'd been working on. They sat in the warehouse's makeshift control room, and Eddie played the album start to finish. Michael's reaction was complicated. He was blown away by the musicianship, by Eddie's growth as a composer. But he was also terrified of what this music represented. Because if Eddie released this album, if he put out material that was this personal and this artistically ambitious, it would destroy Van Halen. Not financially, the band would survive commercially. But it would destroy the creative dynamic. It would prove that Eddie Van Halen had outgrown the party rock formula, that he needed artistic outlets the band couldn't provide. Michael begged Eddie not to release the recordings. Not now. Not while the band was at its peak. Maybe someday, years in the future, when Van Halen had run its course. But releasing this album in 1984 would be seen as a betrayal, as Eddie declaring that Van Halen wasn't enough for him. Eddie understood Michael's concerns, but he resented them too. Why should he suppress his best work to protect a band that was suppressing him? The conversation ended badly, with Michael leaving the warehouse convinced he'd failed to get through to Eddie, and Eddie alone with his recordings and his vodka, more isolated than ever. What happened next has been the subject of speculation for decades, because the recordings simply vanished. Eddie stopped working at the warehouse. The equipment was removed, the tapes disappeared, and for 36 years, almost nobody knew they existed. The most common theory involves Van Halen's management. Michael Anthony, worried about what Eddie might do, apparently spoke to the band's management team. And that team, recognizing the potential disaster these recordings represented, intervened. Not aggressively, not with legal threats, but with pressure. Reminders of contractual obligations, suggestions that releasing this material would trigger lawsuits and financial consequences that would harm everyone, including Eddie. For an artist like Eddie Van Halen, that choice was devastating. He'd created music he was genuinely proud of, music that represented his true capabilities, and he was being told to hide it, to pretend it didn't exist, to go back to being the guitar player in a party band. The vodka consumption increased. Eddie's reliability during Van Halen sessions became erratic. The 1984 tour became an ordeal. Eddie was drinking before shows, during shows, after shows. His relationship with David Lee Roth deteriorated into open hostility. By 1985, David had left Van Halen. The official narrative was creative differences, but people inside the situation knew the real catalyst was Eddie's drinking and instability. The band brought in Sammy Hagar, and the Van Halen machine continued. But Eddie's secret recordings stayed hidden, locked in a climate-controlled facility in Van Nuys, placed there by Eddie's management and essentially forgotten. Wolfgang Van Halen found them by accident in 2019. He was helping his father sort through decades of accumulated gear. Eddie's health was declining. The lung cancer that would kill him in 2020 was already progressing. Wolfgang discovered a storage facility listed in Eddie's financial records, a monthly charge automatically processed for over 30 years. Inside the climate-controlled vault were 12 cardboard boxes, each containing professional reel-to-reel tapes labeled in Eddie's handwriting. Eruption Part 2, Gilded Cage, Amsterdam Rain, and 9 others. Wolfgang took the tapes to an audio restoration facility. The recordings had survived perfectly. The fidelity was remarkable, capturing every nuance of Eddie's playing, every subtle texture. Wolfgang listened to the entire album and understood, perhaps for the first time, the depth of his father's artistic frustration. This wasn't a guitar hero showing off. This was a composer working at the peak of his abilities. Wolfgang brought the tapes to his father's house. Eddie was bedridden, the cancer having metastasized. They set up a portable player, and Wolfgang played the album. Eddie cried, reconnecting with a version of himself who'd still believed artistic integrity could win. Then he said, "This was the best music I ever made, and nobody will ever hear it." As of now, the 1983 recordings remain unreleased. Wolfgang has them, digitized and preserved. There are legal, complications and artistic questions about whether Eddie would have wanted this music public. For fans and historians, this is frustrating. We know this music exists, that it's potentially Eddie's artistic peak, but we can't access it. What these recordings represent goes beyond Van Halen's story. They're about the tension between artistry and commerce in popular music. Eddie Van Halen was one of the most successful rock musicians in history, but his most artistically ambitious work stayed hidden for 36 years because it didn't fit the commercial formula. The 1983 recordings are Eddie's what-if moment. What if he'd released this album? What if he'd insisted on artistic freedom? Perhaps someday they'll be released, or perhaps they'll remain hidden forever. What remains is the knowledge that Eddie Van Halen created music that could have changed how we understand rock guitar, then locked it away to protect the band that bore his name. The album that almost destroyed Van Halen became the album that proved Eddie was always more than Van Halen could contain.